A coastal city usually fears the physical threat of the ocean rising above the shoreline, but the city of Dubai is currently facing something else entirely. The ocean does not need to overflow the streets or breach the concrete barriers to cause a severe economic crisis. It only needs to change its color. Back in the year 2008, a microscopic organism, smaller than the head of a pin, began to spread along the coast of the United Arab Emirates. It remained there for months. Thousands of tons of fish died. Coral reefs suffered extensive damage. Several vital facilities that turned seawater into drinking water were forced to shut down their operations. Today, tens of billions of dollars in premium real estate sit right next to bodies of water that have been completely redesigned by human engineering. The core problem is no longer just whether the red tide will return. The real problem is this: when it does return, where exactly will that water get trapped? This is not a story about the sea rising to claim the land. This is a story about the sea being fundamentally altered from the inside out. But the phenomenon we call a red tide is not actually a tide at all. To understand the sheer scale of the financial vulnerability here, we first need to strip away the terminology. A red tide has absolutely nothing to do with the gravitational pull of the moon. It is the explosive and rapid multiplication of certain species of phytoplankton. These are single-celled organisms drifting in the ocean. Not every single bloom turns the water into a rusty red color, and not every single species of these microscopic plants produces lethal toxins, but they do not necessarily need to be toxic to become dangerous. The real threat comes from the sheer density of their numbers. Imagine billions upon billions of these microscopic cells rapidly multiplying inside a room made entirely of water. They consume the available resources and block out the sunlight. But the most destructive phase happens when they begin to die. As this massive biological cloud decays, the decomposition process starts to aggressively suck the dissolved oxygen right out of the water. The ocean is no longer a place where marine life can breathe. It becomes a locked room that has been completely drained of all its air. The enemy here is not the red color. The real enemy is the density of the biomass. But this extreme density only becomes a catastrophic localized threat when the water has enough time to hold onto it before washing it away. If you look at a real estate map of Dubai, the Palm Jumeirah looks like an incredibly efficient way to manufacture additional coastline. It successfully added miles of premium beachfront property for luxury villas and massive hotels. But if you look at a hydrodynamic map, which tracks how water actually flows and circulates, the picture changes entirely. The structure consists of a main trunk, 17 separate fronds, and a massive outer breakwater shaped like a crescent. This exact geometry created a partially enclosed lagoon system. It is filled with narrow corridors, inner pockets of shallow water, and numerous aquatic dead ends. The water from the open Arabian Gulf can easily make its way inside this complex structure. The critical question is how long it takes for that specific volume of water to find its way back out into the open ocean. Palm Jumeirah did not just build new land on top of the ocean, it essentially built additional residence time for the water itself. And the difference in how water behaves on one side of this structure compared to the inner sections is not just a matter of a few extra hours. It can be a difference measured in dozens of days. To put a concrete number on this difference, we have to look at the scientific field data. An extensive hydrodynamic study examined the water budget and currents within the Palm Jumeirah lagoon. The researchers found that on one side of the structure, the water flushes out and renews itself in about 1.2 days. But on the opposite side, deep within the protective barriers, that renewal process can take up to 42 days. Another modeling study tracked virtual particles placed inside the water. It found that markers placed near the outer breakwater dropped significantly in about a week. But markers placed deep between the fronds retained 30 to 40% of their concentration after roughly 20 days. 42 days does not mean a single drop of water sits completely frozen and motionless for 6 entire weeks. The natural tides still move up and down. The wind still pushes the surface. But that massive number reveals that the speed of water renewal is incredibly uneven. This extended time gives solar heat more opportunity to warm the water. It gives nutrients more time to interact. It gives a population of microscopic organisms a much longer window to multiply before being flushed away. This is not a dead lake. This is a system with pockets of water that refresh at drastically different speeds. If this were just a computer model, it might not be terrifying, but the waters of the United Arab Emirates have already experienced a biological invasion that lasted for over 8 months. Let us rewind the clock to the late summer of 2008. A massive algal bloom, driven by a species known as Margalephidinium polycricoides, began to materialize in the coastal waters of the United Arab Emirates. It did not just drift by and disappear. It expanded across the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Gulf, sustaining itself through the winter and well into the year 2009. Researchers documented that this single event dragged on for more than 8 months on a regional scale. The consequences escalated exactly like a slow-moving biological disaster. First, the water fundamentally changed its color, turning into a thick, murky soup. Then, the marine life began to suffocate. Thousands of tons of fish washed up dead along the shores. Fishing operations had to be strictly limited because the catch was either dying or unsafe. The delicate coral reefs suffered severe damage from the lack of oxygen and blocked sunlight. Coastal tourism took a direct hit as the smell of decay reached the luxury resorts. But the most alarming impact went far beyond dead fish and empty beaches. The sheer volume of organic matter began to overwhelm the intake pipes of several desalination plants in the region, forcing them to shut down. This was not a dirty patch of water blown away by an afternoon breeze. It lasted across multiple seasons. The red tide does not just kill fish. It has the power to directly attack freshwater infrastructure. And this is exactly where the story leaves the beach and goes straight into every single water tap in the city. When a massive algal bloom surrounds a coastal city, the first line of defense is not located on the sand. It is located inside the control rooms of the reverse osmosis and thermal desalination plants. A control room engineer does not necessarily need to see the red water out the window. They will see the crisis unfolding through the pressure gauges on their monitoring screens. Desalination relies entirely on the continuous flow of raw seawater. When a dense bloom gets sucked into the intake pipes, that biomass acts like a liquid wall. The algae and the organic material they release begin to cause severe fouling. The pre-treatment filters get clogged rapidly. The differential pressure across the systems spikes to dangerous levels. The facility has to backwash its filters far more frequently, burning through energy and chemical treatments. For the people living in the city, they might open their kitchen tap and see crystal clear water, completely unaware of the brutal mechanical war happening just offshore to keep that water flowing. This is no longer just an environmental crisis. This is a critical infrastructure risk. Of course, the United Arab Emirates has invested heavily in advanced filtration technology, dissolved air flotation systems, and rigorous monitoring protocols since that event. The technology has improved drastically. But if the technology has completely erased the risk, why does the red tide still need to be monitored every single year? The reality is that the biological mechanism that caused the disaster never packed up and left the region. According to a 2020 annual report from the Environment Agency in Abu Dhabi, they actively recorded and investigated 13 separate algal bloom and red tide incidents in that year alone. Now, it is important to note that this specific data point applies to Abu Dhabi, not directly to the inner fronds of the Palm, but it proves something crucial. Harmful algal blooms remain a persistent, naturally occurring phenomenon that the environmental authorities of the United Arab Emirates must constantly monitor and manage. The events of 2008 were not a one-time freak accident that can be safely forgotten. The permanent threat is not that a single algae bloom will exist forever. The permanent threat is the fact that nobody can guarantee the next massive bloom will not appear. The biological ingredients are always waiting for the right conditions, and when a new bloom inevitably does appear, the physical shape of the palm determines exactly how quickly the consequences can leave the area. The water can carry the problem in, but the geometry dictates how long the problem gets to stay. Think of a conventional oven in a kitchen. An oven does not need to be sealed completely airtight to bake what is inside. It only needs to lose its internal heat slower than the heat is being pumped in. A partially enclosed body of water operates on the exact same principle. It does not need to be blocked off with a solid glass wall. It just needs to flush its water slowly enough so that whatever enters has extra time to linger. A study utilizing Landsat satellite data over 2 decades evaluated the environmental impact of constructing the Palm Jumeirah. The researchers documented observable changes in spectral reflectance, water turbidity, dissolved matter, and surface temperatures in the surrounding water. The palm does not magically conjure algae out of thin air, and warm water alone is not the only cause. A bloom requires a perfect storm of the right algae species, intense sunlight, specific salinity, nutrient runoff, and sluggish water currents. The palm is not the sole cause of red tides. It is a massive, multi-billion-dollar potential amplifier. When you place an amplifier right underneath a real estate market valued in the tens of billions of dollars, marine biology suddenly gets a very real price tag. To understand what is truly at stake, we have to look at how much wealth is concentrated on this specific piece of engineered sand. According to data reported by Reuters and sourced from Knight Frank, Dubai recorded 105 residential transactions, priced at $10 million or more, in just the first quarter of 2024. The total value of those ultra-luxury sales was roughly $1.73 billion. Palm Jumeirah alone accounted for 36.3% of that entire value. Over the full year of 2024, the Palm saw 127 transactions above the $10 million mark, totaling nearly $2.3 billion. By the fourth quarter, the average transaction price on the island hit around 7,305 dirhams per square foot. The people spending this kind of money are not just buying the concrete, the marble floors, or the architectural design. They are explicitly buying the right to access a highly specific, usable body of water. If a beach has to be closed, if the water emits a foul odor, or if dead fish wash up against a luxury retaining wall, the physical mansion will still be standing perfectly intact. But a massive part of the reason it commands such an astronomical price tag has just been stripped away. The risk does not need to physically destroy the building. It only needs to destroy the core reason why the building is expensive. The financial unraveling of a coastal market does not happen in a single dramatic crash. It happens through a very quiet, predictable chain of conditional events. First, the algae reaches a critical density. Then, the water changes color or develops an unavoidable smell. The local authorities naturally increase their water sampling to ensure public safety. As a precaution, swimming and coastal recreation activities might be restricted or temporarily banned. A family might still have a beautiful view of the ocean from their villa window, but a warning sign strictly prevents them from stepping into the water. Guests staying at five-star resorts begin to alter their travel plans or leave poor reviews. The operational costs for continuous monitoring, beach cleaning, and water treatment begin to pile up for the management companies. Eventually, institutional investors and luxury buyers begin to quietly reprice the long-term stability of that specific coastal location. The very first collapse is not found on a real estate pricing chart. It begins the exact moment the shoreline stops performing the function that people paid millions of dollars to enjoy. But preventing that chain reaction requires Dubai to physically see the bloom before the human eye can even detect it. The problem with trying to defend a deeply fragmented coastline is that you cannot protect it simply by looking at the water from a high-rise balcony. Algae does not distribute itself perfectly evenly across the entire ocean. It does not need to blanket the entirety of the Palm Jumeirah to cause a crisis. It only needs to reach a dangerous density in one specific pocket of water, perhaps near a popular swimming beach, directly next to an intake valve, or inside an area where the water exchange is the slowest. Satellites are incredibly useful tools for tracking the ocean, but shallow and slightly turbid coastal waters can make interpreting those optical signals highly complex. By the time the water visibly changes color to a deep red or brown, the biomass has already multiplied exponentially. The most dangerous moment is not when everyone on the beach points at the red water. It is the silent window of time right before that. It is the gap where the organism is rapidly dividing in the warm, slow-moving water. But the human monitoring system does not yet know exactly what kind of biological storm is forming. The crisis does not start when the algae appears. It starts in the blind spot between when the algae begins to multiply and when the authorities realize it is happening. Dubai is far from helpless in this situation. They have deployed advanced sampling techniques, floating sensor buoys, early warning protocols, and satellite tracking to monitor their waters. Desalination plants can adjust their intake depths, deploy protective air bubbles, and increase chemical dosing to fight off the organic matter. The city can heavily control nutrient runoff and attempt to improve localized circulation. Technology is an incredible tool, and it absolutely buys them precious time. It helps them see the threat earlier, filter the water more aggressively, and react with impressive speed. But no amount of sensor technology or filtration chemicals can magically turn a partially enclosed, stagnant lagoon back into a free-flowing, natural coastline without completely altering the very structure that created the real estate in the first place. This is not a failure of Dubai lacking the right technology or the budget to buy it. This is the ultimate paradox of engineering nature. The technology must now be deployed constantly, day after day, just to manage the inescapable consequences of an artificial geographical shape. And that is exactly why the word permanent in our title does not refer to the color of the water. It refers directly to the structure itself. The Palm Jumeirah is a marvel of human ambition, and it will undoubtedly continue to exist. The ultra-luxury villas are not going to sink into the ocean or shift a single centimeter. The multi-million-dollar property transactions will very likely continue to be signed by global investors. But buried deep beneath every single coastal real estate contract in Dubai is an assumption that is never actually written down on paper. It is the absolute assumption that the water next to the house will remain clear, highly usable, and completely under human control. In the year 2008, that exact assumption failed spectacularly on the shores of the United Arab Emirates, for months on end. Ever since that event, harmful algal blooms have remained a persistent threat that requires constant, expensive vigilance. And deep inside the artificial lagoons of the Palm, scientific studies continue to show that the water renewal times remain drastically uneven, creating the perfect incubators for future blooms. That is why this specific threat is permanent, not because the sea will always be red, but because Dubai cannot completely eliminate the risk of a red tide without destroying the very shape of the coastline that they just placed $50 billion of assets upon. Dubai does not need to be swallowed by a rising sea to lose its prized coastline. The ocean simply needs to stop behaving like the pristine product that the market priced it to be. Because ultimately, the boundary between a premium coastal asset and a stranded financial liability is sometimes only as thick as a single algae cell. If you value documentaries that look beyond the skyline and investigate the hidden mechanics of global cities, make sure to subscribe. The next warning sign is rarely where the brochure tells you to look. Disclaimer: this video is an independent analysis based on publicly available data, scientific studies, and market reports at the time of research. Economic, environmental, and geopolitical conditions are subject to change. This content analyzes systemic pressures and infrastructure risks. It is not intended as a personal attack on any community, nor does it constitute financial, investment, or travel advice. Certain conclusions are analytical inferences drawn from the cited sources.